Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me as usual is Angelo Giuliano. And our special guest is Rasheed. Hello, Rasheed from the Red Pill Diaries, his YouTube channel. I'm going to put the link in the video description below after the stream. How are you gentlemen doing this, evening for us, morning for you, Rasheed? How are you guys doing?
I'm doing pretty good. How about you guys?
Right. Yes. We're keeping track of what's going on, especially with the conflict in Ukraine. And I thought what we would do today is actually maybe a little bit of a reaction video to comments made by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. He was at the NATO conference, the contact group for Ukraine, as his predecessor had done for 3 years under the Biden administration. And the things that he said really does not add up with what I think a lot of people are projecting in terms of their own hope onto the Trump administration. I mean, he talked about everything from continuing, expanding sanctions to continuing to arm and back Ukraine, freezing the conflict essentially, and even establishing a Western occupied buffer zone inside Ukraine, which is what we had been warning about for the last 3 years under the Biden administration. It continues unabated under the Trump administration. Is there any opening thoughts that either one of you would like to say in regards to this before we start playing this clip? Angela, anything?
Of course, I think this is we are in a phase where there's lots of bluff from both, especially from the American side, and basically it's a way to put pressure, but what they want to do is a transition where they don't look like the loser, and they basically have a feeling that everything is going to be on the lap of the EU. Because as we've mentioned before, the main objective for the US is to get this Ukraine conflict solved and to shift its focus towards China. That's my main take.
Absolutely. Rasheed, any opening thoughts you have about at least what you've heard so far from the Trump administration regarding the conflict in Ukraine?
I think a lot of it is a bluff. I don't think that America is fully prepared to come out of Europe, regardless of what they're saying. I think that they want to buy time by pushing the Europeans in the forefront, but still maintain the lead or the power behind the scene while they position themselves to go after China, because in their mind, they want to suppress China so that they can then refocus on Russia. China is their main goal, but they want to come back to Russia. They want to pacify this. They want to keep it smoldering until they're done with China, so that they can double back around on Russia.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so obvious, and I hope that, I'm almost certain that Russia understands this, but you never know. I hope they understand this. And one thing I'll point out before we start playing is that Secretary Hegseth even says this is not Minsk 3.0, but literally he's laying out the perfect Minsk 3.0. And when he says that, just for people who might not understand, the Minsk agreements were made between 2014 and 2022 when the Russian special military operation began. And this was the separatists in eastern Ukraine fighting against the Ukrainian military, which was backed by the US and NATO. And the Minsk agreements were meant to pause the conflict because the separatists were decimating the Ukrainian military. It was on the verge of collapse. And so what the US and Europe did was pretend that they wanted to freeze the conflict so that they could create some sort of lasting peace and accommodate the security concerns, the legitimate security concerns Russia had. But what did they admit? The Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, they both admitted that it was just to buy time to reorganize, rearm, and then restart the fighting. So with all of that in mind, let's listen. Everybody in the comment section, please let me know if you hear the audio when I start to play it.
Thank you, Secretary Healy, for your leadership, both in hosting and now leading the UDCG. This is my first Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and I'm honored to join all of you today. And I appreciate the opportunity to share President Trump's approach to the war in Ukraine. We are at, as you said, Mr. Secretary, a critical moment. As the war approaches its third anniversary, our message is clear. The bloodshed must stop, and this war must end. President.
Okay, so right there, I have no problem with that. That sounds great. And a lot of people hear that, and they heard President Trump on the campaign trail say he was going to end the conflict. And this is what everyone is pinning their hopes on, that this is what is actually going to happen. And this is what he started out by saying. And people will hear that and they'll be like, see, it's going to get solved. But then you have to continue listening. And if any of you guys have anything to say, like maybe just raise a hand or something, I will pause it and you can say what you want to say.
Trump has been clear with the American people and with many of your leaders that stopping the fighting and reaching an enduring peace is a top priority. He intends to end this war by diplomacy and bringing both Russia and Ukraine to the table. And the U.S. Department of Defense will help achieve this goal.
All right. But what role does Ukraine have in all of this? Anyone who actually understands this conflict understands that Ukraine was always a proxy. It was politically captured in 2014 by the U.S. through regime change operations. And from that point onward, it was shaped and used by the U.S. to pursue U.S. foreign policy objectives, specifically vis-a-vis Russia. So does anyone think that Ukraine actually, I mean, of course, officially you have to have them at the table, but does anyone believe genuinely that Ukraine has a real role to play at the negotiation table? Rasheed, Angelo, do you think that beyond for appearances, do you think that Ukraine has any agency in any of this?
Angelo?
No, absolutely not. Since 2014, we all know that the whole democracy was hijacked, and basically they actually were the one to pick actually the one that would actually be in charge since 2014, and clearly Zelensky is just reading the CIA script. So in reality, it was always a proxy. What we have here is just a comedian which is doing his job as a comedian. He's following the script, and I think he has probably his backup plan just to go back to Florida and have some U.S. protection.
My thing is this: if I pay the bills, I call the shots. It does not matter your opinion at all. If I'm paying the rent, if I'm paying the mortgage, if I'm paying the car notes, I make the decisions. The United States is essentially doing that for the entire state of Ukraine. So what he has to say is irrelevant. And I ask the people, when has America ever allowed its proxies or its puppets to overrule what they say? Just name the case. And it's not going to start with Ukraine.
Absolutely. And I think that's important for people to also keep in mind. I would add to that, very good point. Europe also is a United States proxy. Angelo has brought this up many, many times. The whole point of the European Union was to impose a bureaucracy on Europe to usurp their sovereignty, their agency, to have this bureaucracy that dictates to the local governments and the people living under them. And it's built in such a way that the people have no real way to address it. It's centralized, it's in Brussels. So if you're in Italy chafing under EU decisions, what are you going to go to Brussels to go protest them? So it's a very elaborate system of control, and the U.S. is the one holding the lever. So that's also important. When they say they're dumping it on Europe, they're not dumping it on Europe. Europe is an extension of the United States.
We will only end this devastating war and establish a durable peace by coupling allied strength with a realistic assessment of the battlefield. We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing the
All right, fair enough. That's true. And admitting reality is not the same as taking actions to accommodate reality. So he's admitting that there is no way for Ukraine now to take back all of this territory that it lost. There's no way. It cannot happen. The US, Europe, they have no way of enabling Ukraine to do this. So that's true. When he talks about an enduring peace, keep that in mind and then listen to his proposals and see if an enduring peace is even possible.
This illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0.
Okay, so there he said it. It must not become Minsk 3.0. And you have to create the conditions so that the war doesn't start again. So what is he going to do? Has the Trump administration, I'll ask you, Angelo, and then Rasheed, have you seen anyone in the Trump administration actually talk about the real cause of this conflict, which is NATO, its expansion, the US and its use of NATO to first encircle, then contain Russia, and then absorb Russia itself, just as they encroached upon Ukraine's borders and absorbed Ukraine? Have you heard anyone in the Trump administration address this?
No, absolutely not. I think if we were to go into the root cause, it would be a major embarrassment for all the narratives that the average Joe has been fed over the years. So I think they still need to keep the narrative as Russia being the aggressor, and somehow that they need to find a solution to stop the war and so on. But they're not going back to the root cause, which, by the way, Putin wants to do. And I think when you look back at how flexible Putin has been, he's done lots of concessions. He's done concessions on Minsk. Minsk, as you said before, the separatists, they wanted, they were winning the war. I mean, basically, it was a big humiliation for Ukraine because they were losing, and then you have this Minsk that actually saved Ukraine. And it puts this conflict into a status quo. So this was one of the concessions of Putin. But remember, Putin, when he was close to Kiev, he actually made another concessions to retreat, to have a ceasefire and to retreat. And I would say that this time, Putin doesn't have the luxury. I think it is impossible for Putin to not find a long-term solution which would actually solve this conflict at once and forever, because Russia cannot do this again. This is the last time that this should be dealt with, and they need to actually have a framework for the whole Europe, security guarantees, meaning that NATO retreating troops, up to a certain level, and that Russia is not back into a confrontation with the EU or NATO in 5-10 years' time.
Rasheed, but very quick, I see in the comment section people saying President Trump has mentioned it,
Yes.
which makes what Secretary Hegseth, what he's about to say, even worse then, because what he's going to say is that NATO needs to be expanded. It needs to be bigger and more lethal. So if you're admitting that NATO is the problem and you're talking about blowing it up in size and capability, then you're doubling down on the root cause of the conflict, aren't you?
Yeah. Trump, he did speak about 2 days ago, and he did say that Biden and NATO were to blame for the war in Ukraine. But that is as far as it went. We have to get to the root. If you don't get to the root, you never find out how the disease works, how and what causes disease, what feeds the disease. I hear the defense secretary talked about we must address the issues on the ground as they are. They're not addressing the issues on the ground in Ukraine as they are. I hear him talking about they want a sovereign Ukraine. Ukraine lost its sovereignty not in 2014. It lost its sovereignty years before that when they were doing color revolutions in Ukraine to overthrow and overturn the elections that were in favor of Viktor Yanukovych, even before they ousted him. So on the one hand, as long as they're winning, Ukraine should be able to make its own decision. But when they're losing, it is we want a sovereign, independent Ukraine. Well, you could have had that if you had accepted the terms that Russia presented, but you refused to accept the terms that Russia presented. And remember that it was Donald Trump that expedited the funding for Ukrainian troops and weapons prior to Joe Biden. So it's not like he didn't have a hand in this. So it's not all on Biden. It's on Obama. It's on Trump. It's on Biden too. So we have to look at the thing as it is and not just piece it apart and just take what we like. We have to show the whole picture.
Absolutely. Let's continue. That is a very good point. Both very good points there, and let's all try to keep that in mind as Secretary Hegseth continues laying out the solution.
That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine at any point, they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5.
So he's talking about no Ukraine in NATO. Fine, but people are saying this is great. This is a huge breakthrough. People have to remember the whole conflict started because that was already the deal. No NATO for Ukraine, and the US, Europe, NATO reneged on it. They waited for the right time where the climate was right for this conspiracy to flourish, and then they went ahead with it. And they said, Ukraine in NATO. Actually, they had a whole list of countries they were going to start adding to NATO after already promising Russia that they would not continue expanding NATO. So this is not a breakthrough. Saying no NATO for Ukraine is not a breakthrough because we've already been there, and the US and Europe, they've already reneged on this promise. And people will say, well, it's Trump. It's different because Trump is different. President Trump himself reneged on an arms control treaty with Russia specifically. We don't have to mention the Iran nuclear deal that he unilaterally walked away from. He reneged on the arms control treaties with Russia, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. And he lied about Russia not adhering to it as a way to unilaterally withdraw from it. So do you see the problem here? Then he says, let's send European troops into Ukraine. So the creation of a buffer zone, which is what they were talking about under the Biden administration and have been taking steps to prepare for as well. Now we hear the Trump administration, Secretary Hegseth, continuing with this same plan, this same agenda. Anything, guys? I will keep going.
But that's just absurd. That's just absurd. It's an insult to the intelligence of Putin. I mean, basically, it's just reframing this in a different way. But those troops would never be accepted by Putin. It actually would be, the equivalence of a war declaration. He said clearly, whoever is going to send troops into Ukraine is going to be eradicated. So, it's just presenting this in a different form, not under the NATO umbrella or under the US umbrella, but ultimately it's exactly the same. And I would say this role might be fulfilled by the, what Pepe Escobar calls the Chihuahua Baltic states and Poland, the most aggressive. And those actually are absolutely not sovereign state. They're completely under the US control. So de facto, they add up other U.S. proxies because the U.S. controls those states.
Exactly. It's just expanding the proxy war. It's not ending it. It's expanding it, and it's expanding it very dangerously. Rasheed, anything?
And a rose by any other name is a rose. You send European troops into Ukraine. These European troops are part of European nations, which are members of NATO. So they could change it quickly after the troops get there and change. Well, this is now a NATO mission, and if you do this, we can put in Article 5 or Article 6 or whatever. So it's just they're wordsmithing this stuff, and Russia has to be very aware of this and not fall victim to this, because America's the desperate one. NATO, they're the desperate ones because they want to get to China, and they need to get to China because time is running out for them.
Absolutely, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Well, I'm sorry, Secretary Hegseth will get to that in just a moment.
There also must be robust international oversight of the line of contact. To be clear,
Well, I'm sorry, but right there, he's talking about there's going to be a line of contact. So this isn't an enduring, durable peace. This is freezing the conflict. There's a line of contact that needs to be closely monitored. So how is that not just freezing the conflict? So again, wordsmithing, exactly as you say.
as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. To further enable effective diplomacy and drive down energy prices that fund the Russian war machine, President Trump is unleashing American energy production and encouraging other nations to do the same. Lower energy prices, coupled with more effective enforcement of energy sanctions, will help bring Russia to the table.
More sanctions. So again, a continuation of the Biden administration. I see people in the comment section saying this is an early negotiating position. You know, the whole problem is the very premise all of these negotiations are taking place on, from the U.S. perspective, is all based on a lie, that this is Russian aggression, that the U.S. and Europe are just reacting to this. And again, he will get to NATO here real soon. That this is not an early negotiating position. President Trump, during his first administration, ensured that all NATO members in Europe and Canada also reached at least 2% of their GDP being poured into NATO, and not just into NATO, but into the military-industrial complex. Obviously, that's where that money ends up going.
Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense.
So do people listen to that and they actually think, no, this is just 4D chess. This isn't just a continuity of agenda, which continued for all 4 years of the last Trump administration and all presidential administrations. I'm not just picking on President Trump. I'm pointing out that American foreign policy continues no matter who is in the White House. This is the whole point that we're trying to get across. He's talking about more arms, more defense spending, expanding the military-industrial base, which was what they were talking about the last 3 years under the Biden administration, and ultimately not really the Biden or Trump administration. The think tanks funded by the arms industry, who Secretary Hegseth hasn't previously worked for, not that we know of, but I was watching his 4-hour Senate hearing, and there was one point where a senator asked him, you said no general should be allowed to retire and work for the arms industry. There must be like a 10-year waiting period. Are you going to hold yourself to that same standard? He basically said no. He basically said no, because I guarantee you he already has something lined up. So people saying that this is us just not wanting to face reality. Are there facts that make substantiate that position, or is it just these people not wanting to face reality, that it's just more of the same? Anyone have anything to say up until now? He's going to start getting into NATO. Rasheed.
Yes, I want to go back to something you said right before you played that clip. You talked about how Trump was instrumental in pushing NATO's military spending to 2%. Now, this doesn't sound like a person that's against NATO, because now he's demanding 5%. And I believe this is a head fake, because you can say, well, they're not carrying their load, but what you're trying, that's literally doubling what you already made them spend on defense spending, which is offensive spending, which means that what you're doing is now trying to build up the military for some reason. At first you demanded 2% and you doubled it plus some for 5%. So this means that you have an objective that you're trying to reach, and it's not a peaceful objective. You understand? To double the defense spending plus some, that is not a person that's intending to disband an organization. That is a person that is trying to build up the armaments and everything that is needed to continue that endeavor of military expansion. I'm just saying.
No, I mean, absolutely. And all along, and again, regardless of who's in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress, there has been all of this talk about expanding NATO, not just to confront and contain Russia, but also to antagonize China on the other side of the planet. I mean, I know people in the audience that have heard these news stories over the last couple of years. So, you know, again, people have to listen to what Secretary Hegseth is actually saying. Stop projecting your own hope that they're going to do the right thing onto them. Just listen objectively to what they are saying.
2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. Increasing your commitment to your own security is a down payment for the future, a down payment, as you said, Mr. Secretary, of peace through strength.
And that will be the argument that Trump supporters make, that this is just peace through strength. But let's think about what happened before the special military operation began. Europe depended on Russia for their energy. They were getting cheap energy from Russia. And as a matter of fact, Europe and Russia and China were all increasingly working together. And the US used this conflict that they themselves engineered to break all of that up. And they went as far as literally blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines to stop Europe from cooperating with Russia. And they're talking about sanctions. Well, what more is there to sanction? There's still hydrocarbons coming from Russia going to Europe. So they're going to try to close all of those loopholes. So in reality, Europe doesn't have any threat. What threat does Europe have? None. There's no one threatening Europe. In actuality, it is this conflict that the US has created, has engineered, because it wants to remove the political order in Russia, wants to politically capture Russia, and then it wants to isolate and do the same vis-a-vis China. That is why all of this is happening. You don't need peace through strength, because there was already peace. Anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Angelo? Brian. It reminds me of Orwellian, 1984. It's war is peace. It's exactly this. And I have it's very clear. What the US is doing, what Trump is trying to do, is actually bluffing, saying, well, I'm going to leave you on your own, Europe. And he's using that bluff. So because they've been trying to increase to 3%, 3% of GDP for military spending, they've been putting pressure on that. So what he's saying, I'm going to leave you on your own in Europe unless you raise your military spending to 5%. And probably this is part of the deal. Is aiming at Europe spending maybe 4 or 3%, and that's the whole bluff. So that's the way I see it. But there's lots of contradictions here, because it's not going to the root of the problem. You see, you want to arm more Ukraine, but in reality, Putin has been extremely clear for the last 3 years. It was about neutralization of Ukraine. So Ukraine becoming neutral, demilitarization, and what he called by denazification, not having a country which is extremely anti-Russian, that is actually
told you to walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a